Well, welcome, and I pray that the Lord will bless us this morning as we open His Word, and as we continue on with our third part in Searching for Love, the geometrics of love. You might be wondering why I've entitled it this, and you will soon find out the reason. But I first want to begin with a story of Mr. Jack. Now, Mr. Jack lives in America, and Mr. Jack is a squirrel. And he loves to eat acorns. Mr. Jack loves acorns so much that during the spring and the summer, he goes and spends all his day looking and finding acorns. Mr. Jack looks for them in the morning, lunchtime, during the night, and all through the night he looks for acorns because Mr. Jack loves acorns. So much that Mr. Jack never gets sick of acorns, and he discovered that in winter there's no acorns. So he discovered he needs to bury them in the ground so he has a stockpile of acorns during the winter. So he spends his summer months eating as much as he can and burying as much as he can, all around the ground where his hole is in the tree that he lives. And Mr. Jack comes to the winter months, and you might not see Mr. Jack around much because it is quite cold, and he spends most of his time in his little hole in the tree. But every now and then, Mr. Jack will run down the tree and go to a pile of nuts that he knows he buried under the ground, and pull some up and then take them back to his burrow and munch on them all during the winter months until the spring comes again. But it so happens that Mr. Jack has buried so many acorns that he can't remember where he's buried them all. Just the place is littered with acorns. So by the time spring comes, Mr. Jack has forgotten at least half a dozen or more of his hidey holes where he's put all these acorns, buried somewhere in the ground. And as spring comes, these acorns underneath, buried in the ground, begin to sprout. And Mr. Jack, as spring is approaching, begins to go and chase the new acorns and the fresh ones, and he forgets all about these ones that were buried underneath the ground. And after year, these acorns begin to grow until under this big acorn tree where Mr. Jack lives, there is many, many other acorn trees. And without Mr. Jack knowing it, these acorn trees will grow up to feed his offspring for many, many generations thereafter. And Mr. Jack is very happy. Now, Mr. Jack, squirrel, does not know what he is doing when he goes and buries and then ends up forgetting. But in matter of fact, there is a relationship between Mr. Jack and the tree, working in harmony together, both to provide for their offspring. Mr. Jack goes and finds the acorns, buries them for winter, buries them to keep his family alive. But in meanwhile, he is propagating the acorn family as well. And in turn, the acorn gives plenty of acorns for Mr. Jack to continue his offspring. And this relationship between Mr. Jack and the acorn continues to go on forever, you might say. We'll come back to this story. Now, our topic for today, the geometrics of love. Geometrics, shapes, dimensions, lines. This is what we want to look at. What is the backbone of love? How is love described or pictured or drawn out? And what is the opposite of love? This is a question we're going to look at first, as we're considering the geometrics of love. What is the opposite to that of the principle of love? Now, to find that, we need to go back to where our key text was found in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 4 through to verse 7. And this is the one text that we haven't yet covered in our past 3 series on love. But it's very important as we're considering this morning. And Paul defines love in these ways. He outlines what love really is, and he uses some comparisons in these verses, what love is and what love isn't, to try and give us a clear picture. he begins here, charity. Now, the word here, charity, I like how the translators of the Bible actually use charity instead of the word love. Because charity implies something greater than the word love itself. Charity implies action. When you think of the term charity in today's world, when you say a charitable organization, what do you think of? You don't think of a loving organization. You think of an organization that has actions that follow. They go out and do something. So I like Paul's definition here. He says, charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself and is not puffed up. It doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, and thinketh no evil. Rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth. Beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, and endureth all things. Now this is Paul's chapter, the love chapter in the book of Corinthians, outlining what he understood the principle of love is, what love isn't, and what love is. Now I want to take all those points and put them out in bullet point form and go through them to try and work out and to look at what is behind this. What is actually the opposite? If we can understand what love is, then we can work out what the opposite to love is. Because this is very important when we're trying to understand love. First point, he says, love suffers long. Now, I think this term here, although it was written many years ago, is where we get our term long suffering from. Somebody who is willing to be patient. They wait a long time, long suffering. Love is kind. Kindness is always in relation to actions. A kind deed, kind action. Showing someone kindness, you can't show somebody kindness by sitting back. You have to go out and do something, say something, write something, speak to somebody, or do a deed. Paul says love is kind. It rejoices in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, and endures all things. This is the definition that Paul gives to love. Now these are the things that love will do. But also within that context there in chapter 13, he defines some things that love will not do. And I want us to have a look at those. He says, love envieth not. Love vaunteth not itself, or does not boast itself. Love is not puffed up or proud, we might say today. It's not unseemly. It's not rude or out of place or out of order. It's not easily provoked. Now, you'll notice here when Paul is writing about what love is not, these are all related to love being inside an individual and the action that follows. Being envious is an action. It's something that is within you that you are. You are envious of somebody. So when Paul is defining what love is not, he's relating love and a human being, the expression or the absence of love. He says, love is not these things. Love thinketh no evil. Here again, you'll find Paul is talking about if someone has love, they will not think evil of anybody. So it's always connected here in Paul's definition of relating to an individual and their expression or the absence of love from an individual. And love rejoices not in iniquity. So, love, the last point we didn't pick up here, that we didn't mention, and I think everything that Paul writes in that verse, the verses, can be summed up in this principle of love. Love never seeks her own. And this is the principle I want to focus on as we're looking at the geometrics of love. Love never seeks her own. So what does that mean? If love is never seeking its own. Now, remember, put it in the context that Paul is referring to the action and the individual, the expression of love or the absence of love. He says, love never seeks her own. Or we could say, love is never self-centered. Because if you're never seeking your own, if love is in you, and if the characteristic of love is inside of you, and you, because of that characteristic, that principle, you never go to seek your own for the benefit of yourself, then we could say that love is never self-centered. Love is not directing to yourself, but away from yourself. And I want to compare that. Let's look at this principle. If love is self-centered, does it work with the rest of the definitions that Paul gave us? Now, if love is not seeking her own, if love is seeking outside of itself, can you be envious if you're not seeking your own self? Is it possible to be envious of somebody when you have the principle of love inside you, where you're not seeking to benefit or improve yourself, but to bless and benefit others? What about being puffed up, proud? If you have the principle and love within you, is it possible for you to be proud? What about thinketh no evil? If you have the principle of love, which is not to seek yourself, not to lift yourself up in any way, but to bless others, is it possible to begin to think evil of others? If that principle is in you, the principle of love. It says love suffers long. If love is not seeking self, but seeking to bless others, can you suffer long with that principle? What about kindness? All these fit with that principle that love is not self-centered, but love is others-centered. Love does not focus in on me. Love is an expression outside of myself to those around me. Paul says love does not seek her own. So if it's not seeking for me, it must be seeking for those around me, outside of myself. So what is the opposite of love then? If love is other-centered, not self-centered, other-centered, what would be the opposite to that? What is the opposite to love? I did a quick research on this, and it's interesting. Many people arguing between this concept that the opposite of love must be either hate or it must be jealousy. And then they were arguing those 2 points compared to that of indifference. Because they said hatred is an emotion just like love. Love moves you to do things. Hatred also moves you to do things. So those two would have to be classed as warm emotion. Yet indifference is the lack of emotion. It would be considered cold. But is the opposite of love indifference? Being indifferent to somebody. What is it? Self-centered. What is another word we give to self-centeredness? If love is not seeking her own but seeking others, then what would I call self-seeking? What's another term we give to that? The absence of love. If you do not have the principle of love, which is seeking others' benefit, then you must be self-centered. And what is self-centered? Selfishness. So I would pose to you, in Paul's definition of what love is, that the opposite to love is actually selfishness. And we looked last week at what happens to an individual when they are void of love. A human being that has a craving to be loved, and that love is not filled within a human being, craves it so much that they will suck it in like a vacuum cleaner. They will take it from anybody. And so, fitly, we can call the absence of love selfishness. The natural heart, we're told, is in this condition of selfishness. Because naturally we are void of the love of God within our heart. Now, if we were to draw love, I think it would look like this. The geometrics of love would be something like this. From a center point, always reaching out to something else, beyond itself. Not grasping inside, but reaching to bless others. Now I want to do a mathematical equation here. Christ equals God. Yes, we all believe that Christ is God. If Christ equals God and God equals love, then what does Christ equal? Christ equals love. So we should now be able to take the principle of love, of seeking them to bless others and not seeking your own self, and apply it to Christ's life, because if Christ is God and God is love, then Christ must equal love. Is this true in Christ's life? I want to take you to Romans chapter 15, verse 13. Very, very significant verse. It says, "Let every one of us please his neighbor for his good to edification. For even Christ pleased not himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of them that reproach thee fell on me." This principle of seeking to bless others outside of yourself can be seen here as Paul describes Christ, that he was not seeking to please himself. That fits with Paul's description of what love is. Love does not seek her own, but love seeks to bless others. John chapter 15, verse 13. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." These are the words of Jesus Christ. Now, it goes on there to compare that even for a righteous man, some might die. When we think of Jesus and his life, he manifested this principle in love by laying down his life for us. But let me ask you a question. If you were to take this verse and to define true love as just dying for your friends, do we see illustrations and examples of that today? How many parents would die for their child? Let me see your hands. Okay, it's not a rare thing. But let's read this next verse, Romans 5, verse 8. "But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners," verse 10 tells us, enemies. While we were enemies, Christ died for us. Now, who of you would die for your enemy? Let me see your hand. The person that has most injured you in your life, brought the most pain to your heart, who is willing to die? The principle of love is to reach out for others' blessing and not to turn inwards. Love is not self-centered, but is others-centered. And the principle of love here is illustrated in the life of Christ. Christ did not come to please himself. Christ came to die not only for his friends, but for his enemies. That is the principle of love, not seeking your own self. What you desire, what you feel, what you want to please yourself, but to bless others. So much so that Jesus said those that become his disciples must portray this same characteristic. Then said Jesus unto his disciples, "If any man will come after me, let him deny himself." There's that thought. Renouncing self-centeredness for that of others-centered. Deny yourself. The first step in taking up your discipleship with Jesus Christ is not the cross, not following Jesus, but being others-centered. We looked at this last week, but I just want to bring this point up again, because I think it's very crucial. A human being with a desire for love in their heart that has never been full, or that is never full, is a selfish individual. And I'm putting this in general terms. All of us fit into this condition when we're born. Children naturally are born selfish, not loving. Yes, they do nice things. Yes, they do loving things. But generally, children are born selfish. It's for me. My wife went to a maternal health nurse to do a checkup on our son. And the nurse took her to a room and showed her a picture, a plaque on the wall. And it said, I think it said the child's rules or something like this. And it said, if I see it, it's mine. If it's yours, it's mine. If I don't have it, it's still mine. Everything's mine. That's how children are. It's about me. And if you only have to have children to see this in play, in reality. You know, when some other child has it, it doesn't matter. It's still mine. It doesn't matter whether it belongs to you. It's mine. Self-centeredness. But a person that has been filled, that desire to be loved, when a desire to be loved is fully met within a human being, they no longer are craving to be loved, but now have love to give. Self-centeredness, selfishness, other-centered, filled with love. Now, these principles of love are not only found in human beings, but they're found throughout nature. And that example of the squirrel, Mr. Jack, is an example of how this principle of love, this seeking to benefit others, is throughout nature. Now, trees and plants and animals do not have a conscience or a mind to be able to make decisions, reasoning ability. But human beings do. So within the plant world and within animals, they are built in this principle of love. For example, the cycle of water. The water comes from the sea, evaporation by the heat of the sun, is taken up into the atmosphere. The water condenses, becomes clouds, moves across into cooler climates, and the water becomes so heavy that it drops out into the mountains. Some becomes snow, some melts down, becomes riverbeds, some goes under the ground, and the cycle continues. One picking up to give to the next, and the cycle is repeated, repeated, repeated. The principle of giving and then receiving. Giving to bless others. Now, these is part of God's creation. These do not have the ability to think or change their own course of themselves. This is God's creation, but the principle is inbuilt. Transportation. A tree, and we can be very thankful for the trees, because without trees, we would begin to suffocate for lack of oxygen. But let's look here. The example here, this principle. The tree receives the rain or groundwater. It's taken up through the plant. The plant uses it, converts it into energy with the help of the sun. And water is again released out of the leaves, taken up by the sun through evaporation, and then the cycle continues. The water falls, the tree takes it back up. And so each is giving and passing on to the other. And all is living in harmony. Our ecosystem is beautifully balanced, except when man plays around. We see the principle here in animals and plants again, the principle of love, to giving, to receive, to bless others. We can find in the example of the bumblebee and the flower. Both give to receive and to pass on. The honeybee goes out to find nectar or pollen. And in the meanwhile, it transfers this pollen to the flowers around it to propagate the flower colony. And in turn, the bee receives the nectar to propagate the honeybee. One without the other are in danger of becoming extinct. But you see the principle here throughout nature. God has instilled this principle of receiving to give, blessing others, not focusing on self-centeredness. And yet human beings, of all God's creatures, the most intelligent of God's creatures, have broken this cycle of love, broken this principle. I want to take you back to the Garden of Eden, and I want to look at an example here. this principle in creation. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 17. And we know the story. I just picked one verse here. Adam was in the garden, a perfect place, where everything was in harmony with itself, with its creator. And then come along the devil and brought disharmony and disunion, rebellion. But before God spoke to Adam, when Adam was about to take the fruit from Eve, something was going through Adam's mind. Adam knew what God had said. The Apostle Paul tells us that Adam was not deceived. He fully recognized what was taking place, and yet he chose to sin. The Bible says Eve was deceived, but Adam chose to sin. Adam was fully aware of the circumstances, God's command, and the results. But he said, I cannot live without you, Eve. I would die with you. Then obey God. That principle of love was built into Adam and Eve. And therefore Adam made his choice that he would follow in his wife's footsteps and die with her. Now, on one hand, we can say that's very courageous. Some might say it's very silly, but very courageous. And yet we read Genesis chapter 3 and verse 12, and the man said, the woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me. Lord, you know that woman you gave me to be my companion, she is the one that gave it to me. Just before Adam was willing to die for this woman, die with this woman, he could not live without her. And now, only a little bit later, as the result of sin now begins to bear fruit in his life, rebellion, separation from God, he is willing to blame that same person that he would die for. Not only blame her, but blame God, whom thou gavest me. God is your fault and that woman. They're the one to blame. Adam was built with that principle to love deep within him. Not self-centeredness, but other-centered. But as soon as sin comes into the picture, as soon as rebellion enters into Adam's heart, transgression, Adam's mindset now is completely changed and he's no longer other-centered. If he was other-centered at this point, what would he have said? He would have owned up, yes, it was me. I made the decision. You made me responsible, but I failed. Forgive me. But no, he blamed somebody else because now he is no longer self-centered. He's no longer other-centered, but self-centered. And from that man on, from Adam on, we have all inherited that disposition to be self-centered by nature. And we cover it up by doing nice things. But many of our best motives and intentions are all covered by a selfish motive. If you were to stop and really analyze how many of our real desires and motives and actions are portrayed or come from the desire to only, solely bless somebody else, with no hope of reward, no hope that I'll be paid back in the future. I want to have a look at some practical examples here of how this principle of love now works in practical reality. Self-centeredness compared to others-centered. Now, I'm going to use this example of a husband and wife because it's very familiar to all of us. But this principle could be related to a relationship, father, son, any relationship that is usually built on the principle of love. This woman here has decided to marry this guy. And so long as he loves her and she loves him, we have a happy relationship. Right? That's all required for a happy marriage, yeah? As long as she is absolutely, totally thinking of serving and blessing and benefiting and making him happy, and he is doing the same to her, what could go wrong? But what happens if, for some reason, he does something to hurt her? Or his love stops for some reason, it dries up. How long will her love continue for him? How long? How long do you think it would take when he's done something that hurts her deep to the heart of her soul? How long could she continue to love him? Months? Years? There would be a point where that love would dry up. That's the natural result. When we're not receiving love, love will dry. Especially when somebody has hurt you. Now, it could be the other way around. I'm just using this example. And this would be a disastrous relationship. But let's have a look here in Romans chapter 12, verse 21. Now, let's say, for instance, that this woman, now we could be using the guy, but we're saying this woman. This woman is a Christian. And she is trying to follow the principles that Christ laid out in his life, which is other-centered, not me. So no matter that he's hurt her, she stays in this relationship to try and show that other-centeredness, to love despite being hurt. Romans chapter 12, verse 21, she tries to follow this instruction. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. So she knows this and she goes, okay, I'm staying here because this is what Christ wants me to do. And then we go to Luke 6, verse 27, which says, but I say unto you, which hear, love your enemies and do good to them that hate you. So she takes this verse and she goes, I've got to stay with this person, even though he's hurt me and maybe he hates me, but I still have to show love to him. How? How will she do that without her love drying up? How is it possible? Because the natural result of somebody that hurts you is that you put blocks so you won't be hurt again. And in putting blocks between you and somebody else, love finds its end. How is it possible that she is to have the principle of love and still love without drying up? We have to put a third person in the equation, and that is God. 1 John tells us that God is love. Now, I'll put this third equation into this relationship. Now, God gave his Son to reveal his love. We have no question that God loves every individual. And because of that love, she responds in adoration and love to God. So she is being filled. She is able to be loved and to love. And we have the principle of love. To receive and give. Other-centered. Now, how long now can she keep loving this guy no matter what he does? She can go on forever because she is being filled. She is not now seeking her own. If she is devoid of love, of God's love, she will be reaching out to be loved only. But because she is now in this relationship where she receives love, the principle of love that was characterized by Christ's love, now she is able to love no matter how he treats her, even if he is her worst enemy. No matter how much he has hurt her, she can continue to love. And so the principle, that Bible text where it says to love your enemies, is possible only when you have this relationship here. Outside of receiving God's love, it is impossible. But when she is full, she can continue to give until she dies. Are you running on empty? How is your love supply in your heart? Those characteristics that we looked at, how does that apply to us? Are we starving for love? Are we crying out because we've been starved of love, but we don't know where to get it from? Are we struggling within our families, within our marriages, because we're missing something that comes from outside of this earth? And therefore manifesting itself in selfish actions that we cover up and make to look that they're actually unselfish? Matthew chapter 11, verse 28, Jesus says, "Come unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Jesus calls out to each one of us here today. He calls out to you and to me, and He says, I have the answer for your search. I have the answer for your desire, the craving within your heart. He says, He offers invitation, come. Come unto me. And Jeremiah 29 verse 13 says, and ye shall seek me and find me when ye shall search for me with all your heart. Christ is offering Himself to us as the answer to humanity's problem. In the search for love, can find a fulfillment in finding Jesus Christ. And if we want to know Him, He has promised that He will be found. He is calling to you today, come unto me, all that labor and heavy laden, because I will give you rest. He will put that search to an end, so you can become full and complete. And no longer will you be a drain on society because you are crying out to be filled with love and seeking it in any way possible. But you can give to the community, to society. You will now become a blessing, not a curse. Have you ever met those people that you spend time with them and you feel like that you're just drained? They just seem to suck the life out of you. They're searching for something. They're seeking something. The natural heart is seeking after love. And only Jesus can fill that in each one of us. I pray that we may find in Jesus Christ a remedy to this problem in our lives. A remedy to this search, for the search of love.